Hey you guys, so it has definitely been a while since I have uploaded any sort of video. Not even just like a talking video, like an analytical type video, just a video in general. Your girl has been through a lot of changes over the past several months. 2022 has definitely kind of started taking turns I never really expected, but I can talk more about myself in a later video. As you can tell from the title, today I wanted to do a little something to celebrate Juneteenth as well as Father's Day. Juneteenth just so happened to fall on Father's Day this year, and I really just wanted to, make some sort of video and just reflect on something. So today we're talking about Black dads, Black fathers, celebrating Black fathers. I definitely think that it's no surprise that especially in American society, Western society, that there is a perverted view that people have of Black fathers, typically about their absence, and all those stereotypes are never good things. And so I wanted to take a moment just to reflect on the history of fatherhood, especially Black fatherhood, and then also relate it to one of my favorite video games, The Walking Dead. How did the idea of the typical American father come to be? So before we get into it, I just want to clarify that today I'm going to be talking about American fatherhood and really just a brief selective side of it. A lot of what constitutes as sort of the typical American father a lot of times stems from middle class, European, and oftentimes religious or Christian beliefs. But of course, in no way in this sort of like short history I'm going to talk about here is this indicative of every father's experience. And also there's no like one right way of being a dad. There was no one prime example of fatherhood. So even though I'm talking about the United States and I'm kind of, narrowing down on a very traditional stereotypical image of fatherhood here, again, in no way is this indicative of every American dad's fatherhood experience. So to start us off, I found a research paper by Ralph LaRosa. This was published in 2007, and it's called The Culture and Conduct of Fatherhood in America from the 1800s to 1960s. So this paper kind of went through the history of what roles were expected of fathers throughout these different time periods. And these are some of the main themes I've gathered from his research. For starters, I think the first thing that most kind of people think about when they think of fatherhood is fathers as the economic provider, the financial provider of the family. That's kind of like the stereotype we think of in societies, that the dad goes to work and just, earns the money for the family. But that actually did not become a commonplace thing until the Industrial Revolution. With the invention of factories, that made it more normal for a parent, typically the father, to go off to work, to commute, and at the end of the day, come home. But before the Industrial Revolution, before, the urbanization of the 1800s in America, it was very normal for fathers to be at home on the farms. Typically, women and children also helped with the family's finances. So I thought that was kind of interesting, is that it wasn't until industrialization that we got that stereotype of fathers like leaving their children and leaving their families to go and work and be kind of like the sole breadwinner of the family. It was more of like a collective, a familial effort to earn finances before the Industrial Revolution. Now, during the Great Depression in the 30s, when a lot of American people were out of work and struggling to find work, the role of a father as a role model or family male role model, as well as sort of a playmate for children, started to become more emphasized, as many men were not going to work and it was hard to find work and stay employed. So we can see even here the dynamic of fatherhood switching because of the social and cultural context and events that were going on. And then we fast forward to the start of World War II. This is where we start seeing a different version of fatherhood. It kind of goes backwards a little bit, and we see a picture of men, and especially fathers, as protectors from like literal violence, but also this protection kind of had a metaphorical sense as well. We start seeing more imagery of more muscular men, and that sort of starts becoming this idea of fatherhood. Men who fight for their families, men who go to war, and more of the physical and metaphorical protection over a family. I also think it's important to mention how discrimination also played into how fathers were perceived in different like neighborhoods and communities. For example, like during industrialization, when, you know, people started going to factories and started going to physical locations for work, we have to also recognize that minorities were not written a part of this narrative of fatherhood. So if the idea was that men were supposed to be protectors and financial providers of families, but jobs, of course, aren't hiring you, it definitely left out people from this envision or from this construct of what American fatherhood should be or typically is. But of course, people who were excluded from those opportunities, whether from work or in the war, that doesn't make the role that they did play any less important or any less crucial in a family dynamic. So because of this, it's definitely important to acknowledge that there is a gap between what fathers were maybe societally expected to be versus what some fathers were permitted to be. And that's definitely going to come up later. So that's kind of like a brief history of the typical American dad and different roles that we see fathers sort of playing throughout history. But the role of a father has definitely evolved over time. We see fathers, as we start to get into more modern years, become more actively involved, not just as outside sources. We start to see them more involved in what's happening in the day-to-day lives of their children and their families. Both parents are definitely crucial to the well-being, the confidence, and the success, the thriving of a child. And like I was saying, like we definitely have started to see that as we kind of move throughout the 21st century. But once we start looking at the intersection of Black fatherhood, I think there is a really important dynamic that we look at there. The way we have viewed Black fatherhood has been perverted. That really starts with the perversion of the Black family. The stereotype of Black fathers being absent and Black families just kind of overall being broken really starts here. We really can't talk about the way Black people have been viewed in Western society without talking about slavery. And slavery was the first moment that we see the deliberate breaking apart of Black families. Obviously, in slavery, where you sell people, mothers, fathers, children were split up. We have slaves getting, like transferred to different plantations. So even upon our arrival in the United States, we have Black families being deliberately broken apart. We have children who can't just be kids, children have to work. And that is the first image of Black family we see as we arrived on the shores of this country. Then when we fast forward after the Civil War, we have slaves being free legally, but just because you free something or free somebody does not mean you erase the 400 years of trauma and separation that colonization put in place. Formerly enslaved begin to reunite with their families, trying to discover, families that have been separated, spouses that have been separated. If any of you guys have seen the movie Harriet, you remember there was a scene where she had escaped to freedom to the Underground Railroad up north, but then when she tried to come back and find her husband actually got remarried. So even, like after emancipation, even reuniting with, your former family got complicated, because whether people were separated, people got remarried, you really don't know what happened to your family. And from slavery, there have been countless other historical, political, systemic events that have kept Black families apart. When the formerly enslaved became free, there was actually a meeting, a consultation with the government asking free blacks what they needed. And the people a part of this meeting told the government that what black people need is land. They need to be able to own their own land. The president at the time, Abraham Lincoln, signed a promise that was going to give all free African Americans at least 40 acres of tillable land and a mule. So you may have heard that phrase, 40 acres and a mule. That was the promise that was supposed to be given to black people after they were free. But weeks later, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and his successor, Andrew Johnson, overturned that promise. So the 40 acres and a mule never happened, and America became a very different country. So this is just one of the first examples we see of Black Americans being denied land, being denied sort of the ability to be able to build a home and a family. A lot about where you live and where you call home says a lot about how you're able to provide for your family and raise your children. So with 40 acres and a mule being overturned, we already have an even further setback, Black Americans, for building that for themselves. As I'm editing this video, I also wanted to make sure I talk about the Great Migration. So basically, like after the enslaved were free, a lot of formerly enslaved went up north to try to find better working opportunities that just weren't available to them in the South. So when a lot of these people went up north, they found themselves facing different challenges like overcrowded neighborhoods. They were getting underpaid for the work that they were doing, and essentially were just put in slums in these cities. And not to mention that a lot of the discrimination and violence just against Black people in general kind of discouraged them from moving out, in addition to them just literally not being able to move into white neighborhoods. And the land and homeowner discrimination still has not, stopped since then. After the Great Depression, President Roosevelt introduced something called the New Deal that helped get Americans out of debt. This kind of consisted of the government giving out loans for people to buy homes and sort of get out of, the position they were in after, the Great Depression. But those loans were given out unless you were considered high risk, and what was oftentimes considered high risk was determined on the color of your skin. Surprise, surprise. And this is where we actually have redlining begin, which redlining is not just a metaphorical term. The government would literally outline in red areas and neighborhoods where the people who lived there were considered high risk from being given loans. So I'm actually going to link a bunch of resources below. Everything that I talk about the different systemic ways that Black people have been refrained from actually being able to build homes, build wealth, and more importantly, build their family, nourish their family, will be linked below. So if you want to learn more about redlining, the history behind it, I would definitely recommend checking out my resources in the description of this video. So yes, redlining definitely contributed to the racial wealth gap, and homeownership being, again, one of the ways that we really see families being established, puts Black Americans back at a deficit when it comes to how we can raise our children and our families and how we see parenthood in the Black community. And still to this day, there are, countless examples of Black people being denied homes. The housing discrimination has not stopped since then, unfortunately. It just manifests itself in different ways. And again, like I said, the links and the references are going to be in the description to different examples. So we have Black people that are literally redlined out, considered high risk for owning homes, which basically forces a lot of Black Americans into impoverished neighborhoods, overcrowded neighborhoods, ghettos, slums, which people don't acknowledge that when you live in a neighborhood that has bad conditions, it's bad for your health. So now we have a number of Black Americans living in overcrowded neighborhoods, in poverty, parents who have to work long hours, sometimes kids even still have to work and take on adult responsibilities at young ages, which again takes off years off of your life and has an effect on the way families are viewed when you live in those conditions. And another systemic way that Black families are still being broken up and have been broken up historically is with criminal justice and mass incarceration, especially around the 80s and 90s. The war on drugs, which again, this is another thing I can link to more information below. America incarcerates the largest number of its population, and it's not a surprise that the majority of those people are Black, brown, and indigenous. So now if you're in this position, you live in a bad neighborhood, say you have one parent that's working long hours, another parent that might have been, separated from their children and their families from the criminal justice system, we can see here that there is countless numbers of systemic ways that Black parents and Black families have been broken. And even if we want to talk about like modern day, even the COVID-19 pandemic, where a disproportionate number of Black Americans died from COVID-19. And a lot of it has to do with a lot of these socioeconomic reasons, and also even the racial uprising. Racism literally takes years off of your life. Racism is bad for your health. So that's also another thing, if we're gonna talk about modern day, of ways that Black families have been broken up. Disproportionate health disparities, health outcomes. There's the poverty, the ghettos, the redlining, being denied land, being denied home ownership, being put at a deficit to build wealth, to own land, and to raise families with that. All of these things combined have affected the way we see the Black American family. I also want to take a moment to mention some of the ways that Black Americans especially were successful during these times. Obviously, there was a lot of, ways that Black people have systemically been sort of put at a deficit when it comes to owning land, building wealth, and all these things. But there's also examples of thriving Black communities such as Black Wall Street, which was in the Greenwood district in Tulsa, Oklahoma in the 1920s. There was literally 40 to 45 blocks of Black homeowners and business owners. They owned theaters, they owned shops, they owned, like barber shops, beauty parlors. There was this area of Tulsa was a thriving community of Black entrepreneurs and families. And so I definitely want to acknowledge, just because in this particular video I'm kind of talking about the systemic ways that Black people have been put at a deficit, there were definitely thriving Black communities as well. So now that we've established the history of the American dad, as well as why it's so important that we celebrate and acknowledge Black fatherhood and Black families, I wanted to give an example relating to a video game. You know how we do around here. And so if you've been following the channel for a while, I love a good story-driven game. And I think one of the most iconic story-driven games is The Walking Dead. And we're going to be particularly talking about Lee Everett, my man Lee, a real legend, a real goat in these streets, because I really think he embodies a really great and important depiction that we need to see more of Black men in society, and especially of Black fathers. So this part is probably gonna have spoilers if you haven't already seen The Walking Dead. I mean, it's been a decade old. Literally, I think it turned 10 years old earlier this year. So if you haven't played this game already, where have you been? But there's your forewarning. And also some of these options, kind of depend on what path you take, like what type of Lee you decide to create in the game. But I mean, from the people I've watched play the game, we want to be a good father out here. So that is also the perspective I'm coming from. So the first thing I love about Lee's character in The Walking Dead is that Lee is not a biological father, but he becomes one. I think Lee's story is one of redemption. He starts out at the beginning of the game, he starts out in the back of a cop car, a criminal. He doesn't come from the best past, which, when you first start out, you see the Black guy, he's in the cop car, you're like, a little side eye. But once you actually get to know the story and get to know the background, I love how Lee was not tied to the stereotypes that oftentimes get associated with black men and black masculinity, of being aggression, being like aggressive, like thugs, criminals. He may have started the game kind of in that way, but he really gets to reestablish himself, and you really get to see his true character shine throughout the game. And one of the main ways we see that is with his relationship with Clementine. So Clementine is a little girl that Lee stumbles upon as soon as the game starts. Clementine is left all alone. Her parents went out on a trip, left her with the babysitter. Babysitter obviously gets clapped or bitten by the zombies. And so Clementine's left alone, and she needs a sort of parent figure, and Lee is able to become that for her. Lee is able to become what Clementine needs her to be. And I think that is really indicative of good fatherhood and just good parenthood, is really lessening of yourself and really becoming what somebody else needs you to be. And so Lee becomes Clementine's protector, he becomes her provider, and really just builds this really meaningful and special relationship with this little girl. Lee is not perfect. He obviously has no like previous parenthood experience, but he does his best. There's even a scene in the drugstore at the beginning of the game where Lee is kind of awkward, where he's trying to get to know Clementine a little bit. He doesn't really know exactly the perfect things to say, but he tries, and just he checks up on Clementine. He looks out for her. So that's the first thing I love. I love the redemption story in Lee's dynamic with Clementine. I love how he really just steps up to the plate and becomes the man, the father figure that Clementine needs, even without having experience. It's the not being perfect, but doing your best, which I love. Another thing I love about Lee's dynamic with Clementine is how Lee makes what's important to Clementine what's important to him. So whether it's like, you know, the literal physiological needs, like, you know, feeding her, making sure she eats, you know, we got limited food supply in the apocalypse, but he looks out for her in that way, but also he looks out for the things that she wants to do, or things that are important to Clementine that maybe not be crucial to the plot as a whole. Even things like at the motor inn, this is again at the beginning of season 1, where Clementine loses her hat, and Lee, if you choose this option, he makes it an effort to find her hat, and when they do re-find, you know, the hat that was stolen, he returns it to her. And it's those little things, because that hat is like the last thing that Clementine's real dad gave to her. It's one of the only physical things she has of her actual parents throughout the rest of the game. And so even something that doesn't seem as crucial as like Clementine's hat, Lee does make important to him. He shows that those things that are important to her are important to him as well. And so it's cool to see those little moments throughout the game. Even when the group in season 1 gets to, is it Atlanta? Or I think it's Atlanta, where Clementine wants to find her parents, which, you know, Clementine's parents been dead and gone, but Clementine wants to go by the hotel where her parents were supposed to be staying at, and she sees them, you know, not alive, but it's those things where Lee was like, okay, we can go look for your parents. That's, again, if you choose that option, but it's the little things that are important to Clementine are also simultaneously important to Lee, and I love seeing that. Last but certainly not least, the final thing I love about Lee's and Clementine's dynamic is that Lee protects Clementine and sacrifices for her in the most kind of, you know, monumental sacrifice you see at the end of the game, which, again, spoiler, is of course Lee sacrificing his life to make sure that Clementine is safe. Lee literally got bit looking out for Clementine and trying to find her and make sure that she's safe. And I think that is super admirable in a man, and that, I think, is what real fathers do, you know, is they look out for the people that are depending on them and the people that they love. I think Lee is a really great representation, an important representation of Black masculinity, redefining Black masculinity, redefining Black fatherhood. Again, Lee was not a biological father, but he was Clementine's dad. He became Clementine's dad during, you know, a time where they needed each other. And so I just wanted to sort of reflect on that. The Walking Dead is definitely an iconic piece in video game history, and especially if you like story-driven games. And so we definitely need to see more examples of redefining Black masculinity in those ways in media. And so I think Walking Dead is probably a piece ahead of its time. It sucks to say, like, 10 years ago, this is like, monumental in video game history, but The Walking Dead really was. Again, having a Black male protagonist to begin with, but then showing him in a way that Black men aren't normally portrayed in media was also super important as well. And I love the way they kind of showed that through this portrayal of him becoming a father and a protector over this little girl. Y'all, so I just finished filming this video, and I actually had a quote that I wanted to read that I forgot to in the video. But it's this quote from Tarana Burke that I wanted to end on. Tarana Burke is the creator of the Me Too movement. But she said this powerful thing where, "I do not believe in your anti-racism work if you have not first engaged with Black humanity." And so I think that's really powerful, and I think that's another reason I love this depiction of Lee in The Walking Dead, is because it's just a depiction of Black humanity. It's not a game about racism. Racism is not the point of the game, which oftentimes when we see Black characters, it's like, let's talk about the racism, or like people of color, which isn't always necessary. And not that there's, a problem with talking about those types of issues, but I think the more we engage with just Black stories and Black humanity, the better off we'll be. So that's another note that I just wanted to add in here. So yeah, that is the video. I hope you enjoyed this like mini video essay. I'm not sure how long this is gonna be, but I just wanted to talk about Black fathers today. I hope you guys have a wonderful Juneteenth, a wonderful Father's Day. I will of course be linking all of my resources in the description, so if there's anything I talked about here that you want to learn more about, be sure to check those out. Check out the resources. I try to link things that are easy to digest and actually can teach you guys things, so hopefully y'all take advantage of those links. What else? Oh, I also did a Clementine cosplay last October, so if you guys like Walking Dead, y'all should go check that out. I actually still have her hat over here. I'm wearing a bun right now, otherwise I could wear this hat, but yeah, this is my I made this hat. I DIY'd this, so if y'all want to check out this hat DIY, I'm gonna link my cosplay of Clementine below. Y'all should let me know in a comment, what is a memorable experience you've had with your dad or anyone else who may be a father-like figure in your life? Yeah, I'd love to know. Let's share some, stories in the comments below. And thank you so much for watching. Again, I know it's been a minute since I've uploaded. My name's Asmara, and I'll see y'all next time. Bye, everyone.